howdy everyone, Phil here from the Blue Envelope channel. So in this video, I wanted to do a video about the similarities between Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. There's a ton of parallels, and it's a video I've been wanting to try and pull together for a while. So hopefully I can kind of do it justice a little bit. I find it really interesting, so maybe somebody else will too. I think it's valuable for witnesses to learn about the Mormon religion and vice versa for Mormons to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses, because I think by looking at how another high control group operates, it can kind of open your eyes to how, oh, maybe I'm in a high control group too. And so it's really helpful in that way, much like watching the Scientology documentary there, Going Clear, or reading the book by the same name. So anyways, that was kind of my goal here. I want to give the caveat at the beginning that, I know witnesses pretty well, but I'm sure I'm going to be making thousands of mistakes about the Mormon religion. So apologies about that. Please correct me in the comments. And one thing I want to mention that we'll see kind of crop up over and over again is that chronologically, the Mormonism religion started 50 years before the Watchtower religion did. So many things that you see in Mormonism or that Mormons changed, years later you see Jehovah's Witnesses do that same thing or change to that same thing. So it's kind of interesting to see that. So I thought maybe I would start out. This is from an interview with an ex-Mormon, and he was like a super high-ranking guy. He worked in the finance department and all kinds of stuff. But anyways, notice what he says about how, leading figures in when religions start.
The book that has had the biggest impression on me, has had the biggest impact on me intellectually, has been Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer. And this is one of the great sociological texts that I've ever read. And what he says is that all great mass movements, ideological movements, have three parts or three personalities. Number one, there's always got to be the guy with ideas and big ideas. And so the man of ideas, the person with ideas. Number two in the movement, you have to have what is called the true believer, the person who really believes the ideas of the first guy. And he's willing to do anything to make that work. And this true believer, he's a tough guy, and he has to do tough things, and he does tough things. And then the third kind of personality that comes on the scene is the practical man of means. They're neither the man of ideas nor are they the true believer, but they're the practical man of means who make the movement work on an everyday basis. And
so when I heard this quote, this was really interesting for me because this book that he's quoting, Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, it's a 1951 book about mass movements. The book is not about Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, but wow, how perfectly does it fit? So Roger Hendricks, the guy in the interview here, he's saying, hey, this lines up perfectly with Mormonism, with Joseph Smith being number one, Brigham Young being number two, and then the other presidents after that. And when I heard it, I was like, whoa, Charles Russell is number one, Joseph Rutherford's number two, Nathan Norris number three. It's a perfect fit. So it's really interesting how the parallels that you see there. Now, looking organizationally, Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses are set up very similarly. So locally, Jehovah's Witnesses have congregations in towns and cities, and then a group of maybe 20 congregations is organized into a circuit. Now, in Mormonism, the congregations are called wards. So you have wards in towns and cities, and then a number of wards, a little less, maybe like 8 or 12 wards, it forms a stake. So the stake is equivalent to a witness circuit. And so witnesses have a circuit overseer who runs the circuit, and Mormons have a stake president who runs the stake. And then right at the top, also a fairly similar arrangement. So the witnesses are run by a governing body of varying numbers. So currently eight guys in the governing body. Now the Mormonism is a little different because there is a president running the church, but right below him is a quorum of 12 apostles. So this is 12 older men, mostly, older white guys, just like the witnesses, and they help run the religion. Now, as you look in the congregations itself, each religion has a 3-member panel that governs the congregation. So it's kind of a 1+2 arrangement in each one. So for witnesses, you have a coordinator of body of elders, and then he has 2 assistants, the service overseer and the secretary. And so they form the service committee. And then for Mormons, you have the bishop, who's like the main guy, and then he has 2 assistants, the first counselor and the second counselor, and they're called the bishopric. Now, interestingly for Mormons, they carry this 3-person arrangement from the bottom of the religion all the way up through the top. So even little kids' Sunday school classes will have a class president, and then the class president has a first and second counselor, so a group of 3. And it's like that at every level, all the way up to the president of the church. So the church president has a first and second counselor. And so those 3 guys are above the quorum of the 12 apostles. Mormonism definitely has more layers of bureaucracy. So you would have thought, if you think witnesses have a lot of layers of bureaucracy, Mormonism definitely has them beat. One thing in particular is there's these ones called general authorities. So these are guys, there's 109 of them currently around the world. And they're sort of, I was trying to think in witness terms, I guess it's be sort of like in between a district overseer or branch overseer and the governing body. So that's kind of the level that these general authorities are at. So maybe like governing body helpers, if governing body helpers had families and lived in houses, and whereas among witnesses, people at that level, they have to be childless and live at headquarters. So it's a little different. There was on Mormon Stories, which we'll get to later, but there was a really interesting interview a couple months back with a lady named Lila Tueller, and she was the daughter of one of the general authorities. So a really interesting interview. She's very well spoken, and just to hear her recollections of growing up at kind of that high level management in the organization was pretty interesting to hear. Now, as a young man in each religion, there's different levels that you can attain to. So, for example, in witnesses, you can be a ministerial servant, and then you can be an elder. But even before ministerial servant, there's smaller achievements once you get baptized. So you can start by doing mics in the hall, running the sound system, helping in a department like literature or territory or whatever. In Mormonism, it's a little more strictly defined, more clearly defined. So from 12 to 13, you have certain tasks you do. Then from 14 and 15, there's a new category that you go up to with more tasks. And then from 16 to 17, that's a 3rd level that you do. So those 3 sections are called the Aaronic priesthood. And then at 18, typically you'd move up to what they call the Melchizedek priesthood. And that's what most adult Mormon men are, in that Melchizedek priesthood. And that opens up more roles. And so that's what the ward bishops and whatnot all belong to that. Now, one interesting thing about Mormons is that they have wards or congregations, that consist entirely just for single people. So these are called singles wards. And typically you'll find them in cities with lots of young people. So either big cities or college towns, they'll form these singles wards because, as we'll see, family is really important. Getting married and having kids is really a key part of the Mormon religion. So how about the meetings held in the meeting houses? Well, for witnesses, of course, there's twice a week. So there's a midweek meeting, which has a bunch of different talks on it. And then there's the Sunday meeting with kind of the main sermon, and then the Watchtower study. Now for Mormons, they also have a 2-hour meeting on Sunday with multiple parts, like witnesses do. And so that's kind of their one official main meeting. They don't have a midweek meeting per se, but they have lots of little committees and groups kind of set up by age and gender in the ward. And each of those typically meets at least one other day per week. So that's kind of their second meeting. Interestingly, each religion has cut back on the meeting time required in recent years to try and make their religions a little more appealing to folks. So for example, witnesses cut out the 1-hour congregation book study about 10 years ago, and then Mormons just in the last year or two cut out 1 hour from their Sunday meeting. It used to be a 3-hour meeting. Now, in Mormonism, women can give talks and prayers from the stage directly to the congregation. And for among witnesses, that's a no-no. Women can only do skits or demonstrations to another woman, and they cannot address the audience directly. So on the Mormon Sunday meeting, that begins with a sacrament meeting, and so that's basically like communion. So they pass around bread and water, and folks partake of that. Now, other than the memorial, witnesses don't do anything like that. But interestingly, Bible students did used to have love feasts, which were very similar. They'd have trays of diced white bread at the early assemblies, and they would partake of those together. Now, once a month at the Mormon meetings, one Sunday is called a fast and testimony meeting. So, and this is an opportunity for, you're supposed to fast 2 meals that day. And then if you want to, you can get up and kind of give your testimony or, talk about why you feel the church is true. So interestingly, that's something that witnesses used to do when they were Bible students in that time period. They called it a prayer, praise, and testimony meeting. And same way, kind of an unstructured time where you could get up and profess your faith to the other members there. So on the one hand, I could see that coming back because, witnesses are kind of getting less about deep Bible study and more about emotional feeling that it's true. And so I could see a section of the meeting. But on the other hand, the society is also moving toward more centralized control of the meetings. And so that would, having this free-for-all session probably doesn't fit into that. So it'll be interesting to see which direction they take that. So so at the Mormon Sunday meeting, they'll have the passing of the sacrament, and then they have some talks. They don't really have like one main sermon per se. There's more short talks like on a midweek meeting for witnesses. And then after that, they split out into Sunday school groups. And so these are divided up by sex and by age. So basically all, the young girls, the middle girls, the teenage girls, the adult women, they all have their own classes in the same way for guys. And then for witnesses, of course, there's nothing like that. There's no session separate for children or for women. All the meetings are always all held together. Now, how about the meetings, the buildings that they meet in? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses basically have 2 levels of buildings. So you have your Kingdom Hall, which is the local places that congregations meet. And then you have the assembly halls, which are less common. And these are where larger gatherings of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 witnesses will gather a few times a year for assemblies. So Mormons have a similar structure. They have local buildings, which they call meeting houses. And so these are where a ward will meet in a town. And then they have a building above that called temples. Now, unlike witness assembly halls, temples aren't designed for large conferences. Rather, they're temples. They're like holy structures which only certain Mormons in good standing can enter. And they're used for ceremonial things. So weddings, sealings are held there. Endowments are held there. Proxy baptisms for the dead are done there. And so that's what temples are used for. Now each stake, which is like a circuit, each stake may commonly have a somewhat larger meeting house, maybe one in the stake, and that is used for stake level functions. But again, it's not really used for large, they don't have large regional assemblies like Jehovah's Witnesses have. Now, the Mormon Church does have large conventions, which they call general conferences, and they have those twice a year. So one in the spring, one in the fall. And it's a 2-day event. It's held at the headquarters in Salt Lake City, Utah. And the structure is actually much like a witness assembly. So there's a series of talks given by different speakers and song and prayer and all that. And so the assembly hall there in Salt Lake City holds about 20,000 people. So 20,000 will attend live. However, the vast majority of Mormons will watch the general conference via teleconference. So the sessions are streamed live to local meeting houses, or they might get recordings if they're way out in the boonies. And so Mormons will basically attend the assemblies in their local meeting house. And that's how they've done it for many years. Now, it'll be interesting to see if witnesses eventually adopt that same method. They do seem to be heading in that direction. So where they used to have large conventions in big cities, now they're kind of downsizing, and a lot of conventions are being held in assembly halls with small groups. And those assemblies, in turn, consist of a lot more videos now from headquarters, so pre-prepared talks and whatnot. The annual meeting is now being streamed to Kingdom Halls each fall. And so it's not too hard to kind of visualize that maybe assembly halls will all be sold off here in the near future, and Jehovah's Witnesses will do it just like Mormons, and they'll just go to their local Kingdom Hall to watch a telecast of assemblies that are being held at headquarters or pre-recorded. Another similarity you see kind of converging is that Mormons they have one meeting house that's used by 3 or 4 wards or congregations, and they have staggered meeting times. And in the past few years, we see a big shift among witnesses now that they're going to that same model, where you have one Kingdom Hall and it's used by 3 or 4 congregations instead of everybody having their own. So another thing that's quite similar between the two religions is how they handle discipline of members. So for witnesses, you confess your sins to an elder, and typically a tribunal will form of 3 elders called a judicial committee, and they'll kind of sit in judgment on you. And there's usually a couple outcomes. You can be publicly or privately, but publicly reproved, and that's the lesser one. And then you can be disfellowshipped, which is the greater punishment, being thrown out of the congregation. And for Mormons, it's very similar. Same way, you confess to your bishop typically, and again, a tribunal is formed of 3 men, and same way. So there are 2 levels of punishment, 2 main levels. So their public reproof is actually called disfellowshipping or disfellowshipment, which is a little confusing for witnesses. And then their more severe punishment is called excommunication. So excommunication is equal to witness disfellowshipping, and then disfellowshipment for Mormons is equal to public reproof for witnesses. So that's how that works. Now for Mormons, the disciplinary council or the judicial committee that can be formed at the ward level, the local level, or at the stake level. So you can have sort of a circuit level judicial committee. And historically, that's been the 3 men running the stake plus 12 men on a stake high council. So you can imagine how traumatic that would be, especially for a woman. Here she goes in and she has to face 15 men sitting in judgment on her. Pretty rough stuff. Now, they just changed in the last few months where they're going to try and supposedly eliminate more that high council involvement. So it'll go back to a 3-men tribunal. So we'll see how that turns out. And of course, neither religion allows recording of the of the tribunal. So how about that? All right, so one prominent feature of the Mormon religion is that they've had a thing on Monday night called Family Home Evening. They've had this since 1915. And so basically for Mormons, family home evening is the idea of gathering with your family at home on Monday nights. And you might have a little Bible lesson, you have some treats, you have some nice family activity that you do together. Um, you may have little assignments that different, the kids in the family prepare for the evening. They may rehearse talks or assignments they have in the ward and that kind of thing. So, interestingly, when the Watchtower Society eliminated the congregation book study in 2009, they started family worship evening. So that sounds similar. And it's basically the exact same thing that the Mormons have always done. So you have a family evening in your home where you sing songs and act out Bible stories, or maybe play a Bible board game, or have different activities that would be fun for the kids, watch a organization video. So they've really converged on that idea. Another similarity is the cartoon series for kids. So in 2013, Mormonism introduced Matt and Mandy, and it's a cartoon comic strip for kids of two little Mormon kids and their adventures. In 2015, what do you know? Jehovah's Witnesses introduced Caleb and Sophia, two cartoon kids and their adventures. So I don't know if witnesses were just copying the Mormons or if both religions use the same consulting firm, but yep, you can take your pick between Matt and Mandy and Caleb and Sophia now. Both the religions use very nice looking websites nowadays, and honestly, they look very similar. And if Mormons didn't wear name tags when they're out preaching, it would often be very hard to tell if a photograph is Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses because they look very similar. But both have a long history of using technology to help spread their gospel. Both religions have owned radio stations in the past. Now, Witnesses never got into into owning TV stations. However, they did used to use in the 60s and 70s. They would have videos like the Heritage video, which is a really interesting, edgy movie that Witnesses made in the 60s, and they would buy airtime and air these on local TV stations. Now, Mormons have always had a more kind of straightforward approach to investing. And so the Deseret Management Corporation, which is owned by the church, uh, owns lots of stuff. So they own more than a dozen radio stations nowadays. It owns one TV station. It owns a major newspaper in Salt Lake City, the Deseret News. It owns BYU University, a chain of bookstores. It offers financial services, has a health insurance company. It owns hotels, malls, condos. It owns a lot of the property surrounding the main headquarters in Salt Lake City of the church. So it's a pretty big operation. Now, I think it's safe to say that Witnesses have always had a similar approach, that they want to invest the donations and use their funds to make more money and be more solvent. And eventually, I think the goal for each group is that eventually they would never need another dollar of donations and they would still be kind of self-sustaining off the income from their principal. So Mormons are just about there. Witnesses not really there. They don't tithe, so that's a big factor. But another thing is Witnesses just seem to be more ashamed of making money off their religion, and they do it, but they try to hide it, I would say. And you kind of see that starting way back at the beginning with Charles Russell when he sold off his clothing chain. He thought there was basically 2 years left on earth before the rapture. And then when the end didn't come, he needed some source of income. And well, at the same time, he wanted to spread his own thoughts on the Bible and his take on it. So he eventually began with the Watchtower magazine and then started printing some books. And he found just kind of organically that people were gravitating to what he was writing. And so he kind of realized he'd be able to make a living off the religion. But I don't think he was ever comfortable admitting that religion and making money were linked together. And that shame has kind of carried on in the organization through the decades. So Well, privately, you get little hints that the witnesses are the organization is very focused on money matters, but publicly, they would never talk about that to the rank and file witnesses. Another notable thing that most folks know about Mormons and witnesses is that they both have a strong door-to-door preaching ministry that they do. And it's a little bit different. Mormons really focus on the number of baptisms that they get done, and witnesses really focus more on the hours that they spend doing the preaching. Baptisms for Mormons can come around quite a bit quicker. So historically, they would hold 6 discussion sessions, which is held with the potential convert, which they call an investigator. And so really an investigator can be baptized in as little as a few weeks even. Whereas it's a little longer for a potential JW convert who's called a Bible student, and they would be expected really to study at least for 6 months out of a book, a witness book, start attending all the meetings, become an unbaptized publisher first, and then after that point, that's when they could get baptized. So it's a longer process. And two, as you see the pace that the Mormons do their preaching work, it's a little more intense than what witnesses do. So, Mormon missionaries do a 2-year stint as preaching door to door. And so about half of Mormon guys do it, and then a smaller percentage of Mormon women do it. And typically they're, like out of high school age, like maybe 19. And then there is some older Mormons that do it after they retire too, but the vast majority is the young folks before, like in between high school and college. But what you see really is that during that 2-year missionary service, they're doing long, like 9, 10-hour days, 12-hour days, and really like hurrying from door to door to get as much done as they can in those 2 years. Now, I think for witnesses, there's a little bit more of a sense of you have to kind of pace yourself, and it's not quite that crazy of a pace because as a witness, you're going to be doing this for 100 years if you live that long. So you need to kind of make sure you can last all that long. There's a common thought for both religions that really the main purpose of serving mission or preaching door to door is really for the benefit of the person doing the preaching. That the most important convert a missionary can make is the person themselves, the missionary themselves. And so as you preach to others, your own faith gets stronger. And I think you see that certainly with witnesses too, that's really the value in requiring witnesses to put in so many hours each month and stand by carts all day. That really the point of it is to experience the rejection that you get. Because when 99.5% of people are either actively rejecting you or just passively ignoring you, all that rejection serves to kind of turn you inward and draw you closer to the organization. And that's a space where you know that you'll be able to commiserate with others about your experiences and find people that support and love you, as long as you keep doing everything that's required of you by the religion. And so it's a kind of an interesting change that the preaching is for the preachers. Another parallel you see is the strong interest in Egyptology by the founders of both religions. So Egyptology was really like the cool high-tech thing in the 1800s. And so with Joseph Smith, you see that he was really interested in that. The Book of Mormon was supposed to be in a language called Reformed Egyptian. He bought mummies from folks that were selling them, and then he bought some papyrus fragments that he said he translated into this what was called the Book of Abraham. And so it's really interesting because they found the actual fragments that he used many years later. And what the fragments say, now that they could translate hieroglyphics, there's no connection. Like what he wrote down in the Book of Abraham is completely wrong compared to what the papyrus fragments say. And then for Charles Russell, You see, he was super into pyramidology, which is the idea that the length of passageways inside the pyramids was connected to Bible prophecy. And so if a passageway was so many feet long, that meant so many years in a Bible prophecy, and that way you could sort of predict when the prophecy was going to be fulfilled. And so Russell took trips to visit the pyramids, and he taped them, and he would show them to other Bible students in movies. So yeah, both those guys were really into Egyptian stuff. Another parallel you see is that beards are really frowned on for both religions, both with no real reason behind it. So interestingly, both religions had founders that had beards. So Charles Russell in the Watchtower Society had a big old beard, and Brigham Young, the second president of the Mormon Church, had a big old beard. And certainly, I think both religions agree that Jesus had a beard. But in the decades since then, it's taken a 180 turn, and really now it would be impossible for a high-ranking leader in either religion to wear a beard and keep his position. They're very frowned on. And both religions discourage beards for kind of the same vague 1970s reasons of, well, we don't want to stumble potential interested people, and only hippies wear beards, and respected business people, none of them have beards. So these really weak kind of non-biblical reasons that are just kind of passed on and not quite in writing, but very, passed on orally, that's to strongly discourage and control people's actions. And really, yeah, that's just what it shows, that it's the ban on beards is a control mechanism to exercise over their followers. And then both religions really have kind of the typical fundamentalist stuff that goes with fundamentalist Christianity, even though maybe neither religion is classically a fundamentalist Christian church. But for example, they both are really obsessed with purity and no sex, no masturbation. Mormons have what they call the law of chastity, and then witnesses have this concept of uncleanness or porneia. And both these things, chastity, porneia, they're these conveniently vague terms that, what do they mean? They kind of mean whatever the church leaders say they mean. And so that vagueness sort of makes members feel like, oh, I'm not quite sure enough. Am I chaste enough? Am I clean enough? So you're never quite sure if you're doing the right thing, and never quite feel that you're good enough, or that you need to be doing more to be more, really be chaste or clean. So it kind of creates this treadmill and this guilt and shame complex in both religions. Both religions have the problem of, on the one hand, sexual repression with the no masturbation and no porn thing, and simultaneously then talking very openly about, inappropriately about frank, graphic sexual topics at the meetings where young children are present. So they both do that. They both have this problem with young men and women secretly watching pornography, and then feeling guilty and feeling that they need to confess this sin to the elders or the bishop. And so that guilt and shame is created. And then simultaneously, both of them have young people who have these very unrealistic expectations of sex because it's based solely on pornography and not any sort of real life experience or counsel. Both groups are very patriarchal. They're both run by men. Now Mormons maybe ostensibly have a little more for women, because from girls on up to adult women, there's different classes and groups that they hold, and each little class and group does have its own president, which is a woman, and then she has two counselors, two assistants. And for adult women, that holds, it's called the Relief Society. But in terms of actually running the church or making decisions, there's nothing for women in either group. Women cannot be elders or priesthood holders. And even in the Mormons, the women that are taking the lead in the Relief Society and whatnot, they're chosen by the men that are taking the lead. They don't choose themselves. So Yeah, very patriarchal religions in both cases. Both religions have the exact same process for when child sexual abuse is reported. So if a local leader, an elder or bishop becomes aware of an allegation of child sexual abuse in the congregation or ward, they're both instructed to call their leadership, call the church authorities. They both have a hotline to call headquarters, and if at all possible, legally, the headquarters will advise them not to report the matter to police, but to handle it internally. And so both religions have a problem with, with pedophilia, with child sexual abuse within the religion. And both religions strongly condemn homosexuality. They're very similar stances there. They both teach that, well, a person may have homosexual tendencies, and nowadays they both kind of say, well, maybe, possibly it is something you're born with, but it is essential that you bury that tendency deep, deep down within you and never, ever acknowledge it or act on it. And in both religions, any actual sexual action of a homosexual nature would be grounds for a judicial tribunal. So there's no path to be a gay or lesbian person within the religion. Both religions have taught over the years that locations in the United States would play key roles after the second coming of Christ. So, for example, for the LDS Church, Joseph Smith taught that the Garden of Eden was in just outside Kansas City, Missouri, and that after Adam and Eve sinned and were cast out of the Garden of Eden, that they settled just in that same area, right outside Kansas City. For the Mormons, so for the witnesses, Adam is like a bad guy in their theology. He sinned and doomed all humanity. For the Mormons, it's not quite like that. They just view his sin as kind of a necessary step for him to progress through the stages of existence. And really, by taking that step, he then enabled all mankind to come into existence and be born, and then they could progress to go on to heaven eventually. And so it was really a good thing what Adam and Eve did. So they view him as a pretty good guy, and that Adam went to heaven afterwards. And so whereas the witnesses teach that Jesus is Michael the archangel in the Bible, the Mormons teach that Adam is Michael the archangel in the Bible, and Adam did all the Michael things in the scriptures. And so they teach that after just before Christ returns for his second coming, that Adam will come back first, and he's going to come back to that same area just outside Kansas City and have a big conference, and then Jesus will return, and then there'll be Armageddon and the Judgment Day. And after that, that New Jerusalem or Zion will be set up in that area too, in Independence, Missouri, just outside Kansas City, and that's the spot where Jesus will do his millennial reign and rule over heaven and earth for 1,000 years. So that's what they teach. Now, as far as Jehovah's Witnesses, especially in the time of, say the 30s, 1930s, the time of Joseph Rutherford, they taught that all the ancient worthies in the Bible, so the Bible patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the prophets, all those guys, they would be resurrected to Los Angeles, California. And that's where they would live. So that's why Joseph Rutherford, he had that 10-bedroom house in LA. He was sort of keeping the lights on for all the Bible characters that would show up any day then. And yeah, they would all live together in Los Angeles. So that teaching kind of quietly got dropped by the society, and the property was sold around 1950, and I don't think any witnesses really believe the Los Angeles teaching anymore. On the other hand, the Mormons definitely still own a lot of property in that Kansas City area, and still hold that there will be a lot of stuff happening there after Christ returns. In recent years, it's safe to say that both religions have really stressed the idea of being prepared for disasters, whether biblical or just natural disasters. Now, in the case of the Mormons, they have definitely pretty much always stressed that idea. And I think it kind of comes out of from back when they were settlers, traveling out west to set up camp and having enough supplies and whatnot. And so even today, the idea is really stressed to rank and file Mormons that they should have at least a 3 month supply of food and water and money and supplies like that in their homes. And then even more, like years worth of real basic supplies like beans and grain. And then beyond that, beyond individual Mormons, the church as a whole, the organization kind of practices what it preaches. And so the church owns many places, farms and ranches. They own one of the largest cattle ranches in the whole country. They have, strawberry plantations and peanut farms and, large farms for grain. So they own those spots, and then they own the next level. They own the food processing facilities. So they own a peanut butter factory and canning plants, and they have large grain elevators filled with grain. And so they're able to process and can the food, and then taking a step beyond, they have stores that they sell store brand food. And so these are called home storage centers, and there's roughly 100 of them in the United States and Canada. And these are spots where you can go and basically buy bulk shelf-stable food. So you can get big cans of beans and grain and powdered milk, and all that kind of thing. And it's pretty cheap because basically ordinary Mormons are encouraged or recommended to volunteer some time regularly at the peanut butter factory and the strawberry canning factory and things like that. And so the costs are pretty low, and then they kind of sell it at cost so that every Mormon can be prepared for whatever. Because Mormons teach similar to witnesses. They teach that things are going to be really bad on earth before Jesus returns. So that's how Mormons teach. Now, for witnesses, for many years it was much different. There was no teaching that you should prepare beforehand for disaster. And really, most of my life as a witness, there was the belief that if you were prepping, you were showing a lack of faith in Jehovah to be able to take care of you when disaster strikes. And so it was more or less discouraged. But I would say after 9/11, after that 2000-ish time, the rhetoric really shifted from the organization, and they started to stress being prepared for disasters and the Great Tribulation and earthquakes and things like that. And so now you see terms like go bags in the literature, and they stress really the idea. They're not quite on the 3 month level that the Mormons are, but they stress that every witness, adult and child, should have a backpack, with a 3-day supply of food and water and money and medicine ready to go just in case of disaster. And then even beyond that, based on a lot of the recent videos and whatnot, shows witnesses hiding in hidden bunkers or rooms in their house. And so some witnesses have even taken that to heart and started building hidden spaces in their house where they can hide from the authorities during the Great Tribulation. And certainly the idea of having a go bag, being able to sustain yourself for 72 hours, is recommended by emergency organizations and FEMA and all that kind of thing. So it's a good idea. It's just kind of interesting to think about why did the organization of witnesses shift their thought about this from it being a lack of faith to being a good idea to be prepared. And I have a couple thoughts on it. I think on the one hand, maybe the idea of encouraging witnesses to be prepared, and you got to have your go bag ready for at any moment. And I think it serves to kind of ramp up the anticipation that, oh man, Armageddon must be here any minute if I need to have this bag packed by the door and ready to roll. And so it kind of helps keep that level of excitement and fervor among the witnesses. And then on the other hand, I think too, maybe the society was a little frustrated because, they had sort of created this sense of learned helplessness among witnesses where witnesses wouldn't do anything unless they were instructed to first by the organization. And so what that created was when there were natural disasters, floods or hurricanes, you had all these witnesses huddled in the Kingdom Hall, and they had nothing. They had no clothes, no food, water, medicine, anything like that. And yet they were expecting the society to provide all that for them, because basically that would be Jehovah providing for them, proving that he was there in this time of need. And so I'm sure that got kind of expensive for the organization to have to handle all these natural disasters. And so I think that probably played a part too, that they say, listen, guys, you need to be a little bit prepared and at least have a 3-day supply of stuff till we can kind of supplement that for you. So yeah, so witnesses have definitely gotten into the prepper mentality in the last 15, 20 years. Now, the interesting thing is that the home storage centers that the Mormon Church runs, these little shopping centers, are open to non-Mormons as well. So you don't have to be an LDS member to go and buy stuff there. And so, I mean, it's actually a pretty good resource if you're trying to create, get set for disasters and build up your food supply and whatnot. I don't know how many actual witnesses would ever go to a LDS-owned grocery store, but I'll put the link in the description below in case anybody would like to check it out. There's kind of one in most major cities in the U.S., and it's a really affordable way to get foodstuffs for if you're trying to prep a little bit like that. And so those are maybe some of the most obvious similarities between Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. So in the next video, in part 2, we'll talk a little bit about, are there notable differences between the two religions? So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to, and we'll catch y'all next time. Take care.